Hello, everyone. My name is Shannon Bontrager, and Vin over at Revenant Reads tagged me to do this Life Stories tag. And I thought it was really interesting. I know a lot of you have done this already, and so I appreciate being tagged. I appreciate the shout out to Vin. Took me a couple of days to get organized for this because I had some of these books in my office at work that I had to get them before I could do this, but I have them now, and so I'll give this a shot, and hopefully you like it. Um, question number one: do you have a preference for biography or autobiography? Uh, I'm a historian, and so the answer to that question depends on what I'm trying to do. So if I'm trying to look at primary sources, um, I like autobiographies. They oftentimes can give some insight into events that are happening, and you can use the words that these autobiographical words, you can use them to sort of lay a baseline down of how you can then analyze or interpret events that are going on around them. So a great example of that, and I'm trying to make you a little jealous, Vin. I think you mentioned you want to read General Grant. Um, I have an original, an original of his memoirs. He wrote this. He finished it just, I think, a month before he died of cancer. General Grant did. It's this is volume one, and I also have volume two. This is seen as a classic and a sort of a hallmark of how autobiography should be done. He recounts his successes and his failures in the Civil War and as president reasonably well. I think it's now up to a new generation, including myself, to reinterpret these events. He doesn't necessarily understand, for example, some of the implicit racism that he has. He's a man of his era, or some of the other implicit biases that he might have, being a man of his era. But he also is crucial in keeping the United States together and in overseeing Reconstruction shortly after the Civil War. So, in this way, if I'm writing about this, I would love to see an autobiography. But in other ways, I would probably gravitate more towards biography, reading for myself or reading for my historical interest if I'm not writing. One book that has really influenced the way that I think about biography is by a professor named Jo Burr Margadant. She wrote this several years ago, but her book called The New Biography looks at women in France who were supposed to be relegated to the private sphere, and how women challenged that idea of that only men could be in public. And she looks at several women and how they did that. But what makes this book interesting, and I think why she calls it the new biography, is because she uses these women to then look at how society around them is operating. So the biography serves a purpose not just to tell the story of these women's lives, but to tell the story of the context rather than looking at the person and having the context in the background. This new biography takes and flips that and kind of puts the context in the foreground and puts the individual in the background. And I find that to be very, very interesting. And that speaks to the way that I think about this question, I think. So, with that being said, I'll go to question number two. Do you gravitate towards a specific area like sports, celebrities, or history? Um, I'll read a sport biography once in a while if I'm really moved by the individual. But I tend to think of sport and celebrity biographies more along primary sources. And so I don't really read them for myself, really. I really focus more on history for the most part. And in particular, I like to look at history biographies, but I also like to look at travelogues. So I don't know if that's exactly in the genre of biography, but I'm going to put it in there. It's as a subgenre. So here's one travelogue. I use this in my class, and I think it's fascinating. The Adventures of Ibn Batuta, a Muslim traveler of the 14th century. So Ibn Batuta is kind of like Marco Polo. Ibn Batuta is from Morocco, and he lives in an age where Islam, the Dar al-Islam, the domain of Islam, spans from the Atlantic Ocean, from Spain and Morocco, all the way across the Middle East, across Africa and the Middle East, up into Russia, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, through India, and there's even some Islamic communities in China. Ibn Batuta attempts to basically do here is to travel, and he wants to see everywhere that Islam exists. That's his goal, and so he does. He goes on this trip. His trip is significantly longer than Marco Polo's. I think it doubles or nearly triples the amount of miles and the amount of time that Marco Polo travels. It allows us to see an African perspective of the world and a Muslim perspective of the world and I think that that's unique because I think in U.S. history classes, people tend to gravitate towards Marco Polo and more European or Eurocentric kind of interpretations. I like this version here because, as you can see, Ross Dunn is the editor of this. So he took Ibn Batuta's travelogue and he edited it to make it a little more readable for the modern reader, and I think he does a really nice job. Question number 3. Have you ever read the life story of someone and in doing so change your opinion of them for better or worse? And the answer to that is yes. Almost everything I read, I'm going to probably change my opinion of them a little bit. One, because I learned something about them and about the complexities of their life and what they're trying to accomplish. I don't necessarily like the idea of better or worse. As a historian, I don't necessarily want to judge individuals, but I do want to learn something from them. So I kind of shy away from this idea of better or worse, but I do definitely learn some things personally. I might like or dislike what's going on. Yeah, I usually always learn something. And I'll give you an example of this. I could pick many, many books to do this, but I'm going to pick this one. This is the 3-volume collection of Persepolis. This came out several years ago. Marjane Satrapi. Sorry, I mispronounced it, I'm sure. Originally had 3 volumes. This is a graphic novel of her life and her family's experiences during the Islamic Revolution in Iran. What I love about this book is she tells the complexity of Iran through her family's life. Her family were part of the intellectual elite of Iran, and they're largely secular. They supported the revolution when it began. This is the complexity that I'm talking about, right? Her family was secular, supported the revolution when it began because the Shah was corrupt and was unpopular. And when the Shah was coming down, they were all for it. And then, of course, in the middle of this revolution that seems to be secularizing Iran, the Ayatollah and the Islamic elite come in and they hijack the revolution. And what her family thought was fantastic now became a nightmare for them. It was very, very difficult for them to now have to abide by these religious rules, and particularly for her because she was this girl at the time learning about the world. And as she's becoming a woman, she is conflicted. She finds it difficult. How the Islamic Revolution could change the history of her country so much, you have to remember that Iran has inherited the ideals of what we would call Western civilization just as much as anybody else has. Particularly if we think about the ideals of Western civilization coming from the ancient Greeks, the Hellenistic age, of which people like Alexander the Great, and before that his father, Philip of Macedon, took Hellenism and turned it into this culture that then spread throughout much of the world. If you pay attention to where Alexander conquered, he didn't conquer Europe. He never even was interested in Europe. He went to Persia and conquered the Persian Empire. Interestingly enough, the Persian Empire becomes Alexander and his father Philip's sort of muse. They're inspired by people like Cyrus the Great, who was tolerant of other religious ideas, excuse me, and didn't really like slavery and tried to eliminate it and tried to promote culture. And what the Hellenistic world is going to do is take these Persian ideas, originally in Persian, they're going to try to develop them in Greece and then spread them across what we today kind of call the Middle East and Persia. Satrapy inherits that legacy just as much as I have. But her dreams are, at least in Iran, are going to be disillusioned by the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And so that's a great example of how biography, I think, can help change our opinions and help us see the complexity that humans have to deal with. At the end of the day, we see that humans are more like you and I than perhaps we might think. Question number 4. Must you always know who the person is before picking up their life story? And the answer to that is no, I don't. But I do need to know the context of their life, or I at least need to know the historical moment in which they're living in. It's usually not the person that gets me to pick up a biography. It's usually they're talking about an event or a moment, and they have something interesting to say about it. Let me give you an example of this. I picked this book up at a Barnes & Noble sale. It was like $4 or $5. I couldn't believe it because it's a gem of a book. It is by Mariam Said, who is the mother of Edward Said. Edward Said is this giant intellectual of the late 20th century. He died a couple of years ago. He wrote Orientalism and many other fascinating books. This book is her story. It's called A World I Loved, and she does have Wahdad Markazi Cortez helping her write this book. But A World I Love, the story of an Arab woman, is this really elegant telling of the creation of Israel after the Second World War and the disruption that it caused amongst Arab people who had to sometimes forcibly be moved out of areas, businesses taken over, controversy that still dominates the politics of Israel and the Palestinians and the Middle East today. The Said family are not Muslim. They come from a Christian background, and so it makes for a very interesting way for them to kind of tell this story, to navigate this story between a Jewish-dominated state of Israel and a Muslim-dominated Palestinian people. And she does some very clear-eyed analysis of this from her perspective as a mother, as a humanitarian. Really fascinating analysis here of how this not only affected her family and how they had to leave and flee, but also many others. Question number 5. Have you ever met someone whose biography or autobiography you've read? And the answer to that is yes. One person that I met and then read is John Lewis, the civil rights leader from here in Atlanta. He died last year, I think, last summer. Another a person who I met and then read the biography. I lived for a year in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan a long, long time ago. I taught PE and coached basketball teams and lived there for a year in Amman, Jordan. And as a consequence, I got to meet the Queen, Queen Noor, American-born, and she has this Leap of Faith, Memoirs of an Unexpected Life. So, two people that I can say yes to for question number 5. Here's question number 6. What do you think about books that are described as semi-autobiographical? I don't mind them. Sometimes you have to read everything with a grain of salt, and when they're semi-autobiographical, that kind of suggests that they may not be completely honest or credible. But I think sometimes they are. So here's an example of a book. I've spoke about this in another video, but this is called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. This is a story of Harriet Jacobs, who's a slave. Her life is incredibly traumatic. She has to navigate not only being a slave, but the sexual politics of the plantation. She eventually runs away, and she wrote this book before the Civil War, so while slavery is still legal. And the genre of the book is not strictly autobiographical. It's more of a drama. The genre doesn't necessarily document anything. And so for the longest time, scholars said that this was a work of fiction. Recently, it has been reclassified as a work of semi-autobiography. And the reason that she chose the genre that she chose, drama rather than history, is because she's trying to convince particularly women in the North that they need to support abolition. And what better way to try to make that case than to dramatize or to tell in a very dramatic way the story of her life rather than having to document everything. So in this case, I think semi-autobiographical is the absolute perfect genre for her to choose. I think is brilliant, actually, what she was trying to do. And question number 7. Give an example of a life story that really surprised you. I picked this book up a few years ago. It's called The Living Unknown Soldier. It's a very thin work of history. Basically, it tells the story of this man who survived World War I, and nobody knows who he is. He is found in France at a train station, wandering the tracks amongst the trains, and he can't remember anything. He doesn't know his name. He doesn't know where he's from. He can't remember his parents' name. He doesn't know anything. He has no memory whatsoever and of his own life. He's a soldier. They're able to deduce, the psychiatrists are able to deduce that he's a soldier for the French military, but they have no way to identify him. So they have to make him, they make up a name for him. They put him through all kinds of tests trying to figure out what's going on with his memory. And he never really recovers it. It's a sort of a sad story, but a fascinating story to help you think about how post-traumatic stress disorder, what the time they call shell shock, how it affects memory, and how we might commemorate the unknown soldiers of society, but in fact, the living who survived the war can be traumatized to the point of they have almost complete memory erasure. A fascinating book. I really thought that was interesting, and it really surprised me about all the things that they tried to put him through to try to help him through shock therapy with electric shock therapy, through psychoanalysis, which is kind of a new invention at the time. They do everything they possibly can to help him try to recover his memory, and he never really never really succeeds. It's sad in that regard, but surprising. Question number 8. What biographies or autobiographies or memoirs are on your to-be-read list? I have 2 that I want to read. One for my own interest, David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass. And for the book that I'm working on right now, I'd like to read something on a good biography on John J. Pershing, who led the U.S. forces into World War I. Question number 9. Whose life story did you find particularly hard-going, either emotionally difficult to read or very boring? What was really emotionally difficult for me to read was Tony Jute's The Memory Chalet. Tony Jute, you can see it's not very long of a book. It's a good book. I think this is the last book or second to last book he wrote. Tony Jute is this giant in history circles. He has done all kinds of brilliant work in European history. And then he got diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. So he basically lost the ability to move. And when he wrote this book, he actually could not move his body. He had to have an attendant help him to even scratch an itch if he had to. He's completely immobile, and he was in the last few months of his life. But his mind was still functioning powerfully. And he would lie awake at night, and he would remember all these stories. And he figured out that the way that he could remember them for the next morning, so he would have these memories, he would be thinking about this, and then he gradually would go to sleep. And the way that he would remember what he had thought of the night before, as he would, and apparently this is true, we associate memories with location and place. Oh, I remember when this happened. I was in such and such a place. Well, he does this in a ski chalet that he used to go to as a kid, and he would imagine a room, he'd reproduce that memory of that room in his mind, and then he would remember his childhood stories or his young adult stories in that room. So the next day, he would be able to tell his assistant, who would actually, he would dictate the words, and he would write the story down word for word. He would be able to recall all these events that happened to him. And so he has this biography of his world growing up in post-war Britain. I think he was riding the tube in London. I think it was like 8 or 9 years old and stuff like that, and how the world had changed so much. It's a really incredible story, but also sad because, of course, this disease is taking his life away from him in slow motion and in agony. And so I really liked this biography, but I also felt terrible for the conditions that he was in at the time. Number 10, is there anyone you know who you feel should have their life story written down? Yes, I don't want to go into too many details about this because their stories are personal, and I don't know if they want to necessarily talk about them or not, but I'll give you a clue. This I've read recently. Gerald Walker has written this book, The World in Flames, A Black Boyhood in a White Supremacist Doomsday Cult. This is his memoir of growing up in the Worldwide Church of God. And in another video, I talk about how I had a similar experience because I grew up in the same church, but he was black growing up in this church. I was white growing up in this church. In that way, our experiences were different, but in a similar way, we were both colonized by a cult. And people have to go through their own decolonization process. There are many, many other people out there who I know have experienced similar things, and they're contemplating writing a memoir or a biography, and I would encourage them to do so. The stories will be fascinating and amazing. Question number 11. Have you ever read any diaries or collections of letters? If so, which ones did you find interesting? I read diaries and letters all the time as part of my research. I go into archives. I find these diaries and letters, I read them. They are oftentimes fascinating. I'll give you a small idea of one that I liked. It's in the book, in my book that came out last year. But these are the letters of Arthur Bluthenthal, who's from Wilmington, North Carolina. He is from a German Jewish family, and Arthur Bluthenthal goes to fight the Germans. He fights before the United States even enters the war. He goes to volunteer for the French military. He is a former football star for Princeton University. He was on the team that won I think it was the 1909 or 1908 national championship. He played center for Princeton. He's 5'8" and 186 pounds, and he was playing center. When the war broke out, he went and volunteered to serve as an ambulance driver for France, and basically did heroic things every day. In that he would take wounded from the front lines and bring them to the hospitals in the back lines. So he'd basically have to run a gauntlet of German and Bulgarian artillery shells as he was taking French soldiers who were fighting in Serbia in the Eastern Front, from the front lines to the back lines to get to the hospitals. And then later he served in the Lafayette Flying Corps, which were American soldiers who flew in the French Air Force, where he was shot down and killed. And he sent letters home, and they're fascinating. He has this very big personality, and that shines through in his letters. Fascinating story, and that's just a sample of some of the stuff that I come into contact with quite often, and really interesting and helpful in that way. Question number 12. What are a few life stories you would recommend to us? Okay, there are tons and tons and tons and tons, so I'll just try to give you a sample of a couple. We are reading this in my class right now, and I think the students really liked it. I just read their book reviews of this. Really interesting, by George Takei. They Called Us Enemy. This is a story of him as a little boy in the Japanese internment camps. So very relative at the moment to American society and the scourge of anti-Asian hatred that, particularly here in Atlanta, just a few miles down the road, a couple of weeks ago, these horrible shootings that took place in these massage parlors. My students read this book. Sadly, they had to turn their book reviews in, I think, just a couple of days after this terrible event happened. But the book is very interesting. He talks about, it's a graphic history, again, done in black and white here, and he talks about his time in these camps. He's just a little boy. He didn't know what was going on. His parents tried to turn it into a vacation. And so he kind of actually had some good times with his friends on this vacation. But then as he gets older and he is processing this as a young man, before and during, while he gets he plays on Star Trek, he confronts his father. How could you let this happen? How could you not stand up? And then, so there's a very powerful and intimate conversation between him and his father about, the complexities of all of this and how it unfolded. And Takei does a really nice job of explaining that process. Here's another one that I picked up. I heard this on the radio. I didn't know anything about it, but it's really good. It is Anne Marlinburg. So Charles Lindbergh's wife wrote this book called North to the Orient. In 1931, 1932, I think it is, they were trying to find a passage to China through from the United States. So they basically flew from, I think they started out in New York or Washington, D.C. or Boston, the East Coast somewhere, I think. And they basically would fly in this plane, and then they have to land in these stations all through northern United States into Canada. They'd have to go into Alaska, and then they had to jump to Japan and then to China and to refuel. And her husband's piloting, but she's operating the radio and communicating with all the bases and all the antennas and all the little, where can we land, and we need to fuel up, and she's charting their progress. So she's crucially important to this journey. And then she writes really elegantly about it. They meet all kinds of incredible people, native and indigenous peoples in Canada. They're there when the is it the Yellow River floods in 31 or 32, and all these people are just killed in China. It is really fascinating and interesting little travelogue biography, and one that is worthwhile reading. It's not very long and really, really interesting. Natasha Trethaways, Native Guard. This is a collection of poems. You can see that it's won the Pulitzer Prize. It is very, very thin. You could read this in an hour or two pretty easily. It's just poems. Really incredible poems. She is brilliant. Here's one. She takes the idea of the Native Guard. So the Native Guard was after the Civil War is over, it's black soldiers who guard Confederate prisoners. Then they write their letters home to their friends. She found these letters and she was so fascinated by them. So she wrote poems around the Native Guard that then she uses to help explain her own life as a girl becoming a woman. So going through like middle school, high school, even some are when she's a child. Her family, her mother and her father, divorce. So she's talking about how the past really affects her life. And how the decisions that other people made still are something that she has to contend with, if you will. Really fascinating poem. Here's a quick sample. Southern History. Before the war, they were happy, he said, quoting our textbook. This was senior year. History class. The slaves were clothed, fed, and better off under a master's care. I watched the words blur on the page. No one raised a hand, disagreed, not even me. It was late. We still had Reconstruction to cover before the test, and, luckily, 3 hours of watching Gone with the Wind. History, the teacher said, of the Old South. A true account of how things were back then. On screen, a slave stood big as life, big mouth, bucked eyes, our textbooks, grinning proof. A lie. My teacher guarded, silent, so did I. Fascinating sort of stuff here she has all throughout this interesting biography that is really a collection of poems. All right, I went pretty long there. There's so many biographies and ideas that I wanted to share, and I hope you find them interesting if you made it this far. Thanks again to Vin for tagging me and letting me participate. I'll end it there. I'll see you next time.